So here's where the Irish have always had an advantage because we're English speaking. So it made it much easier for us to transition from just being actors with intertitles to becoming actors in classical Hollywood, because the sound era, although some people had kind of voices that didn't transfer from silent to sound, the Irish could. So that gave us a head start, and that's always given us a space in American cinema that other ethnic groups haven't been able to occupy.
Welcome to Ireland and the Making of America,
a podcast exploring how Ireland and the Irish helped shape the United States, politically, culturally, socially, sometimes in ways that people rarely think about.
I'm Liam Kennedy, Director of the Clinton Institute for American Studies, Trinity College Dublin.
And I'm Scott Lucas, journalist, political analyst, and professor of U.S. and international politics at the Clinton Institute.
In this episode, we're joined by Ruth Barton, who's Professor in Film Studies at Trinity College Dublin, and the author of many publications on Irish and Irish-American cinema, including the books Irish National Cinema and Acting Irish in Hollywood. Ruth has also written a best-selling critical biography of the film star Hedy Lamarr, and also of the Irish silent director Rex Ingram, and we'll hear more about him soon.
In this episode, Ruth will help us explore the Irish experience in Hollywood and representations of the Irish in American cinema from the earliest 20th century to today.
So Ruth, hello. Welcome to Ireland and the Making of America.
Thanks, Liam, and nice to see you, Scott, as well.
Thank you.
We're looking forward to this conversation because we've talked quite a bit here about the more historical, political, social, and maybe broadly cultural elements around the settlement of the Irish into the United States, what contributions they've made. And although there's been brief references to cinema, we haven't managed to dive into it in any depth. So we're really, really glad to have you on board to help us do that today. Now, in an earlier conversation, you mentioned that it might be helpful to sort of break this down a little, and I like the ideas. So let's take this really in three periods. Thinking about cinema. Let's start with that early period in the early 20th century, move forward into the mid-20th century. Some would call it the classical period, I suppose, of Hollywood. And then let's get forward to today and talk about contemporary Hollywood and the Irish contributions there as well. So Ruth, if we make a start with early cinema, where is the Irish contribution? Where are we looking? Are we looking behind the camera? Are we looking in front of the camera?
Well, I think we're looking everywhere in early cinema, and part of the kind of fun, but also the chaos of early cinema is that everybody's piling in and everybody's trying their hand at it. So although when you look at the kind of, the structure of Hollywood and the history of Hollywood, you're really mostly looking at the immigrants, largely from Eastern Europe, many of them Jewish, who were the kind of entrepreneurs who saw an opportunity and started off making the very early films that we're familiar with, that kind of 1 minute, 2 minute films, and then set up the studios that are now still very familiar to us, like Fox, MGM, and so on. So that's got nothing to do with the Irish, but the Irish, like others ethnic groups who were at this point really flooding to America, also saw their opportunity. And I think one of the things you have to kind of remember is that although we think of American cinema as Hollywood cinema and interchange the two, in fact, the early cinema was based in New York, and it wasn't until really the teens that it moved to Los Angeles and subsequently to the area that is Hollywood, and that's how it becomes called Hollywood cinema. But it, is it Hollywood cinema? Is it American cinema? And that's one of the kind of bigger debates that people have. But anyway, so you get a lot of people kind of trying their luck, and many of the names that start ultimately will fade out. And of course, notoriously, the transition from silent, if you like, cinema to sound cinema, so many of the ethnic groups having to fall out because they couldn't speak adequate English to continue. So here's where the Irish have always had an advantage because we're English speaking. So it made it much easier for us to transition from just being actors with intertitles to becoming actors in classical Hollywood, because the sound era, although some people had kind of voices that didn't transfer from silent to sound. The Irish could. So that gave us a head start, and that's always given us a space in American cinema that other ethnic groups haven't been able to occupy. So just to kind of wind back then to the early period, which is also called the silent cinema, though clearly it wasn't silent at all. There was musical accompaniment, and in fact there was a lot of music not necessarily accompanying. But anyway, so you do get people who arrive in, see an opportunity and take it. And I'm just gonna, rather than trying to cover everything, I'll just kind of hone in on a couple of names.
Good.
So to start maybe with behind the camera, one of the most successful and funnily kind of still rather forgotten names that came out of Ireland, emigrated to the States, and ended up making a massive career in early cinema was Rex Ingram. He was born in Dublin. He was the son of a Church of Ireland rector, so the family moved from place to place with him. But his upbringing was in Kinnitty, in County Offaly, and the people of Kinnitty are very proud of him. But he, as a teenager, for many reasons, largely personal, much of it through the death of his mother at an early age, left Ireland, never to return, and decided to try his fortune in the United States. And so he winds up. He was very artistic. He winds up at Yale, where he trained to be a sculptor. Now he didn't finish his career. He didn't finish his studies at Yale because he got waylaid by cinema, and so this is in the 19 teens, if you like. So like many people, he just kind of drifted into New York. He was by the stage he moved to New York, and he started just various different roles. But he actually started as an actor, and he was a very good-looking man, but he was a very bad actor. So that didn't go too well. But he was also a writer, and he was very attracted. Then he could see that there was going to be money to be made, and he needed money. He didn't have any. So he then moved into being a screenwriter, and he gradually moves up the ladder. He gets work with Biograph Films. He moves into the kind of cherished role as director. I mean, when I say that, you've also got to kind of remember that in this very early period, there wasn't the kind of publicity machine that there is now. So the audiences going to the cinema were going to see films. They didn't really know who directors were. Even at this kind of period, they were only just beginning to know who stars were and their names and all that kind of publicity that came up around it. So he starts off as a director. He works his way up with short films. And then in 1921, he makes a film that was going to make him famous, which is The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. And not only does it make him famous, it makes his star Valentino famous. The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse is still an incredible film. If you ever get a chance to see it, particularly with a live score, it is an incredible film. It's a war film, but like most war films, it's an anti-war film. And Valentino is the beautiful young tea dancer who in Paris, he leaves his family in the Pampas in Argentina, and he moves to Paris, and there he entertains the ladies at tea dances, and there he also meets Alice Terry, the actor, who was also Ingram's wife. So he'd married Alice Terry, who had Irish roots but was American, and she becomes his collaborator in his films as well. So she's working with him making them, and she's also starring in them. And this film and then he joins in World War One, and then the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse are incredible kind of visual imagination of the sort of apocalyptic nature of war, and in specifically World War One. The film did incredibly well. Well, the Germans didn't like it too much, but other people did. And so, as I say, this really made his name and Valentino's, although Valentino had appeared in other films. And this allowed him then to move on and he had this series of what we'd now call blockbusters, notably The Conquering Power, with Valentino. Then he fell out with Valentino. He moves on to The Prisoner of Zenda. That was 22, another huge film. Scaramouche, 23, The Arab, 24. There's this film. where he made enormous sums of money for his studio, but also he had the kind of the power to dictate how he made his own films. And so there's where the sculptural background comes in, because his play of shadow and light is extraordinary, and they're really visual films. But inevitably, because he was that kind of person, he fell out with Louis B. Mayer at MGM. He decamped to France, where he didn't set up the Victorine studios in Nice, but he made them his own. And he worked out of the Victorine. He made another great film called The Magician, continued to work until he just became disenchanted, particularly with sound, because like many of the people working in silent cinema, he saw it as a visual medium. And then when sound came in, for a lot of people, that's the end of cinema, right? Sound is the end. So he, for him, it certainly was. So he converted to Islam. He became a Muslim and spent many years traveling in the desert with nomadic tribes until he became too ill, and he returned to Los Angeles to his wife, where he died. In fact, he died quite young, 1950. So that's Rex Ingram, and he was, consistently in the 20s. He was one of the top 3 directors in Hollywood. So, along with people like Cecil B. DeMille. So I think we probably should celebrate him a little bit more than we do.
I know you've already done that. I can't let that go without mentioning that you have written a book on Rex Ingram, and
yeah, I wrote a book about it.
His story is every bit as extraordinary as you've just said. I mean, there may be some people watching or listening who are wondering, does any aspect of his Irishness come through into any of that later work, or is it really just the origin story that's Irish here?
It's really just the origin story. I mean, I've always kind of thought the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. So the screenplay was by June Mathis, who's a very celebrated screenwriter from that period. We know they were reading Yeats at the time, and I've often thought that the idea of the apocalypse comes from Yeats, and that there is a sort of exchange there of ideas. He also, I mean, particularly in later films like The Magician, he does have a very Gothic sensibility, and again, I think we can, I don't think it's pushing it too far to think that his roots in Protestantism and Irish Protestantism, which gives us, particularly that very specific kind of guilt-ridden Irish Gothicism. I think that probably did influence him, but he didn't really have Irish characters, and he never returned to Ireland. He always kept meaning to, and he kept in touch with his family.
At the root of what we call Hollywood, then, there is that Irish presence behind the camera. What about in front of it? Because there's quite a few Irish actors, right?
There surely are, but I think the most extraordinary story is the Moore brothers. So the Moore brothers were born, the big family, born in Fordstown in County Meath. Father was a farmer, and he decided to, like so many people of his era, he decided to emigrate to the United States to seek his fortune. So they emigrate at the turn of the century along with that huge wave of Irish immigrants. They emigrate not to the east, but they emigrate to Ohio, where there are opportunities for farming and for acquiring land. But particularly the 3 older boys, who are Matt, Owen, and Tom, didn't really take to Ohio. Tom and Owen, the 2 older ones, in their teens, they ran away from home and they joined a traveling theatre company. And through this traveling theatre company, they drift in to early cinema, and that's a fairly conventional move from theatre into cinema at this point, because they were the only people who had actor training. I mean, there was no such thing as screen actors. So 1908, they joined the Biograph Company, and this is the start of their careers. But also, Owen at this point meets and marries Mary Pickford. And of course, Mary Pickford is one of the huge names of this period, who also has Irish origins and often played actually Irish parts at this time. So they were the celebrity couple in the early days of cinema. But the marriage didn't last too long, because unfortunately she became considerably more famous than he did, and he wasn't too happy about this. So the marriage ended, and also too, he had drink issues, but he managed to keep his career on the rails, after the marriage. And he played in numerous films. He was a very big star of that period, moving into, in fact, the talkies. His really big film was a film called She Done Him Wrong, which is kind of romantic comedy with Mae West. But he succumbed to alcoholism and died again quite early. But then his brothers, so he was the best known of the Moore brothers, but his brothers Matt Moore, Joe Moore, Tom Moore, and their sister Mary all had careers, substantial careers on the big screen during that period. So it is amazing that you've got this one family that comes over with this entirely rural background, no artistic leanings, and they all get work in cinema, and they all really thrive in cinema. So they're the kind of most prominent family, I guess you might say.
What kind of parts are they playing?
Well, they're playing lead roles. I mean, Owen Moore was a romantic lead, not necessarily Irish roles at all. I mean, actually, many of the roles played at this period were not played by Irish actors, but they were Irish, because in silent cinema it didn't matter what accent you had; anybody could play anything. So they played actually straight roles, if you like, and they were leads, or they were second or third in line, and the romantic comedies. But there were masses of Irish characters, particularly in the comedies, and these were really roles that had been inherited from vaudeville. So at this period, vaudeville is feeding in not just the actors, but also the kind of notion of entertainment. And so these sort of stand-up routines that were really popular in vaudeville that might only last a minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, these all come flooding in then to early cinema, which basically means people putting the camera in front of the actors on the stage and filming it. And so a lot of these are based around comic Irish stereotypes, which come with that influx of immigrants. And there's a whole range of Bridget films. So Bridget is this hapless maid who routinely gets employed by an upper crust American family and inevitably causes chaos because of her ineptitude. But she's also a good soul. She doesn't mean to burn the house down. It just happens that she lights the wrong stove, or she drops the matches or whatever. She's also quite often in love with the local Irish cop on the beat. And so that's another stereotype that comes in very much, which is the Irish cop. And then the other figure that emerges out of these sort of vaudeville characters and has a very long life is the Irish gangster. So you're really looking at Irish maid, Irish cop, Irish gangster as coming in, and many of them are structured, particularly the maid cop, are structured around sort of comic roles and mishaps, and the idea that these immigrants didn't get the sophistication of maybe WASP culture because they were coming from unsophisticated origins, and what they had to do, ideally, in the kind of language of the time, was to assimilate and to drop their vulgarity and to become proper Americans. And then the other thing, just to kind of finish up on this theme, is there's a series of race comedies, particularly Irish Jewish comedies, and these are really, again, coming from vaudeville. There's the Cohens and the Kellys are the really big ones, and the Cohens and the Kellys, they're always knockabout comedies. Inevitably, the daughter of the Kellys falls in love with the son of the Cohens, and so there's this cross-racial comedy, and then the families all have a big fight quite often, and fighting is very much, part of how the Irish express themselves in these films. There's a big fight, everybody resolves their differences, and the two youngsters are permitted to go ahead and get married.
It is funny to hear these things because, of course, one has vague stereotypes in your head, and we realize that they have origin points. They're coming out of this period, right? And maybe we'll have time to suggest they haven't entirely disappeared before we're finished on this podcast. Just one other aspect of the early period before we move on. The Irish, I am assuming, are also an important audience in America at this time. Does that play into the kind of films that get made for them? I mean, there's a lot of focus on immigration, isn't there? And ethnic sagas and ethnic comedies and ethnic romances.
They are a part of that huge immigrant audience that escaped basically it's pretty awful living conditions to go to what were to become the pic. I mean, so it starts in the Nickelodeons, which are cheap local neighborhood theaters, but then you get, particularly in the 1920s, you get the rise of the picture palace, which are extraordinary. They are palaces, extraordinary luxury venues with thousands of seats often, and often done over in sort of exotic. You might enter into your seat via a forest or whatever, and so classically the immigrants and the Irish escaped their pretty awful living conditions and working conditions to go to what was now becoming the cinema. And it was also an opportunity to go to date, right? Because if you wanted to meet your boyfriend, girlfriend, you certainly couldn't do so at home. You could do so by going for a walk in the streets, but it was really much better to go to the movies for dating purposes. So there was, and also they're seeing themselves on the screen, but also the thing that we're not talking about, they're seeing their home country on the screen too. And this is not just the Irish immigrants, it's the Italian immigrants and others, because these early filmmakers were taking their cameras, and the travelogue was a very big part of early cinema, and they were taking them to places, including Ireland, and shooting scenes there. So you could go to the cinema and you could see home in a way that you're probably actually never going to return home, despite what you might imagine. So there was a big place in that. And then I guess, again, the other thing that is probably worth mentioning in terms of the Irish influence in Hollywood was censorship, because around about the late 20s, early 30s, Hollywood realizes it has to clean up its act, because if it doesn't clean up its act, it's always going to be a cheap ticket entertainment. And if it wanted to get the middle classes to come in and pay more for better seats, it had to clean up its act and not have the reputation for kind of tawdriness that it had acquired. So it starts to clean up its act. But the people who are really given the responsibility of doing this are people like Joseph Breen, for instance, and who was an Irish-American Catholic. And it becomes very much Legion of Decency, very much involved in this, also very much influenced by Irish-American Catholicism. So a lot of the push to clean up the screen becomes influenced by the kind of moral codes of Irish-American Catholicism.
Okay, so we're seeing lots of different angles there that are impacting the Irish role. We're going to move forward a little bit in time. I know there's no clean demarcation, but if we do start to talk about classical Hollywood, what is that period in your mind? But more particularly, what shifts or changes, or what are the new dynamics of the Irish presence?
Okay, classical Hollywood, it's a kind of movable feast, but you're really looking at the sound era onwards. So 29 is the jazz singers, so from then on. But also it's a period where the kind of that sort of chaotic nature of early cinema had vanished, and various studios had emerged out of this anybody can do it kind of moment. And various studios had emerged, and so you get basically the big five, you get MGM as it eventually becomes, and Fox and so on, Warner's, and so you get a much more structured system in Hollywood, and also what's called vertical integration. So that means that these big studios, they not only made their films, but they distributed them, and they owned the cinemas in which they played. So they had much, much more control over content. And you're into, the structure too of the A movie, which is sort of 90 to 120 minutes. and then the B movie, which is somewhere between 60 and 80 minutes. And so people going to cinema would have seen a double bill, A movie, B movie, plus maybe some news items and advertisements. So it's becoming a much more conventional, much more structured system, and so the kind of amateurism that had, we see in the beginnings has kind of faded out. You just can't be an amateur really in this structure. So that shifts out a lot of people who were just having a go, if you like, and they move elsewhere. But it also opens up, further opportunities, and if you are contracted to one of the big studios, whether as a director or as an actor or as whatever you like, a makeup artist, then you're basically, you don't have a job for life, but you've got a security of income, which you didn't have in the early years. So it's it cuts both ways, because they own you, right? You have to, by and large, you have to make the films you're given to make. There are very few. I mean, we celebrate the big auteurs that come out of this period, but most people were jobbing directors who turned up in the morning and told you make this film, and they said yes. And if you're an actor, you could be making 3 films in one day, 3 different films, and they hand you a script and you say yes. And so you have security, but you also don't have a great deal of leeway. And any notion that there's a kind of huge amount of personal creativity in this system is largely kind of invented after the fact. But you do get certain figures who emerge, who are seen to have managed to exert their own personal influence on their own filmmaking. And of course, one of the huge ones, very much fetishized by the people who look back on the history of Hollywood, is of course John Ford. And it's really worth stopping with him at this point, because Ford is Irish American. Although he was born in Portland, Maine, both his parents were immigrants from the west of Ireland, and he always considered himself to be Irish, and he was very proud of his Irish identity. And he also made numerous films, both with Irish characters and with Irish themes, and set in Ireland. So I don't think there's much more to be said about John Ford that hasn't been already said. But just to kind of brief recap, so he's born 1894. His parents are saloon keepers in Maine, and it's by hanging out in the saloon that he gets to. The saloon was largely frequented by immigrant Irish, so he picks up the kind of Irish cultural markers that would have, that would still be very alive for that first generation of immigrants moving into second generation. And so he's born Sean Feeney. He changes his name to John Ford. He starts working in the early film industry, and his brother Francis Ford was already working as quite a prominent actor. So he starts in the early period making silent films. He actually acts a bit too. He's a Ku Klux Klan rider in Birth of a Nation, and comes out in 1915. But in 1917, he starts directing, and all his first films were westerns. And this is, of course, what we mostly associate Ford with, was My Name is John Ford, I Make Westerns. In 1926, he makes his first Irish film, The Shamrock Handicap, which is filmed in America, but it was about an immigrant Irish family and their fortunes on the racetrack. In that year, he meets an actor called Michael Morrison, who was shortly to change his name to John Wayne, and you get the beginnings of this extraordinary relationship, which was a sort of real love-hate relationship between Ford and Wayne. But he puts Wayne in famously in so many of his westerns, and most people think of John Wayne as being a cowboy. And then he starts making the series of Irish films, Mother Machree in 1928, Hangman's House, also 28. And then the really big one comes a little bit later, which is The Informer in 1935. And also in 1935, in The Informer, he's using Victor McLaglen, who was really of Scottish ancestry, as one of his stock actors, and he forms this kind of troupe of actors who he always regularly works with and who work with him. And then this opens out to include Maureen O'Hara, who he has this notorious love-hate relationship with, and she kind of won, I think, in the end, because she outlived him, and she got to write her memoirs, which she called "'Tis Herself," and she really dishes the dirt liberally on Ford, and of course he couldn't answer back from beyond the grave, but she accused him of a lot of kind of pretty creepy things. So he makes The Informer 35. He makes The Plough and the Stars, the adaptation of the Sean O'Casey play in 1936. But then he makes other films, but 1952 he makes The Quiet Man, and he makes this in Ireland. And this is, still one of the most influential films about Ireland, made in Ireland, that ever, because not only does he make incredible use of the landscape, and it's in Technicolor, and he has John Wayne and he has Maureen O'Hara in it, but it's also riddled with stereotypes, and the kind of stereotypes that we were talking about before, which is the priest. Well, there's the Irish drunk. There's a leprechaun basically in it. Mickey Nogue Flynn, played by Barry Fitzgerald, who's going to emerge too as one of the kind of really classic Irish actors of this period. And so it's the kind of film that, people love to hate, because it was hugely influential, for instance, just on tourism. But it established an image of Irishness in the American imagination, I think, and the Irish American imagination that lingered on long, long after the kind of incidents that were in it were history. But it becomes sort of almost a kind of way of seeing how the Irish American image of Ireland became almost set in stone and didn't evolve, whereas the people who were living in Ireland began to have a very different kind of set of expectations about what Ireland should mean. And so you get a kind of almost divergence at this point, which this film kind of marks, which is a sense that the Irish American is slightly out of touch and has this sort of slightly dreamy, nostalgic vision of Ireland, whereas in Ireland, this is 1952, by the 60s particularly, Ireland is modernizing at pace, and doesn't recognize itself on screen in films like this. So it's a really important film for all those reasons. And you get many films being made that are very deliberately deconstructing the kind of image of Ireland by Irish film directors. But yeah, so that was him, and he also made a whole heap of, and particularly what's called the Cavalry trilogy of films that have Irish characters in it, but not in lead roles, other than Rio Grande, which has John Wayne and Maureen O'Hara, at this time as a married couple, though in fact they were not a married couple, but later on when they made The Quiet Man, they have to fall in love and get married again. But for the most part, the Irish characters in his films are secondary, and they're often the kind of knockabout humour. They supply the knockabout humour, and actually he uses Victor McLaglen for this a lot. So Victor McLaglen in a series of films plays Sergeant Quincannon, who, he's always drinking, he's always brawling, but he's essentially a good heart, and he's full of kindness, but he's very much that kind of stereotype.
Okay, well, this time period, Ford, we have to look at, we have to talk about. There's no question about it. I mean, he is absolutely at the heart of Irish American cinema, as it's commonly understood. But there's a lot else going on in that period. I mean, there's too much for us to talk about. But in terms of that kind of sentimentality that you mentioned, maybe we have to bring up Bing Crosby, or at least think a little bit about the kinds of movies that Crosby was involved in, because they were very successful, weren't they?
Oh yeah, I mean, he was the classic Irish crooner. I mean, again, he's Irish American. He's second generation, and the big one for him, I mean, and the one that most people kind of saw him in first, is Going My Way, and it's such an important film. Going My Way, with Barry Fitzgerald. This is, we're moving well into the classic period. Going My Way came out in 1944. it's the story of, in it, Barry Fitzgerald plays this Irish American priest. He's very much part of the neighborhood. Everybody knows him, but he's a kind of strict father figure in the neighborhood. He's kind, but he's got very family held views about how things should be done. In comes Bing Crosby as this all singing, all dancing, cool priest. I mean, he's the kind of hot priest, isn't he, of 1944. And he comes in and he's got all these modernizing ideas. And in fact, he's been sent in to basically sort out Barry Fitzgerald and to modernize the church. So in a sense, it's also about Irish Catholicism looking at itself and renewing itself, this film. But it's also absolutely this standoff, if you like, between Old Ireland and Barry Fitzgerald, and this new image of Irishness as song and kind of slight sexiness and of course the singing. So Bing Crosby really, he steals the show, and he moves on to represent that kind of modernizing a newer form of Irishness that I think coincides with perhaps how the immigrant community wanted to see itself.
So is another way of putting that we're also moving into a period where Irish America is changing. In other words, that it's maybe a case that they're getting a bit more accepted. You used the word assimilation. In other words, as ever, Hollywood sort of, does map onto, broader social and cultural change, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think you've got to kind of look at assimilation as sort of in terms of how it works on the screen anyway. It's kind of cutting two ways. One is that the Irish, by being English speaking and white, could pass as American very easily in the strict understanding of what Americanness meant in that period, and rather disconcertingly now. And so they could demonstrate assimilation very well, but at the same time they had a specific culture, particularly around singing, as we've just said, but entertainment, comedy, singing, sentimentality very much, that was specifically seen as Irish. So you could be both and, if you like. You could be both a white and American, but you also proposed a kind of otherness, and that otherness could be either threatening, as in the bad gangster films, if you like, or it could be entertaining, as in the song and dance films. And again, I guess the person on whom much of this hinges is James Cagney, because this is the sort of where James Cagney comes into his own as an Irish American, and plays many Irish American roles, from the kind of early pre-censorship years where he could be celebrated as a gangster, to the post-censorship years where he had to be punished for being a gangster. And where he can play charming and he can play menacing. So he offers, if you like, the two sides of that assimilation coin. But then he also, he plays the absolute, the classic is Yankee Doodle Dandy, where he plays the Irish American showman, George M. Cohan, and he's, of course, Cagney is also a fantastic tap dancer. So he sings, he dances, and he is the entertaining Irishman, who is also very much enthralled to the power of the White House and recognizes the authority of the White House. So he's not a disruptive immigrant. He's an immigrant who wants to show the best of immigrant culture to American society, or to WASP society.
So that image is also an image of, I suppose, of an ethnic masculinity that's becoming more incorporated and romanticized. We've focused on masculinity quite a bit here accidentally, and I think we should say something about maybe some of the female stars of the period. One I'd particularly like to ask you about, because I think you're writing a book on her, is Margaret Sullivan, isn't that right? Sorry, Maureen
Sullivan. Yeah, thanks, Liam, I am. So, as it happens, I've always been interested in Maureen O'Hara, Maureen O'Hara was, probably until Saoirse Ronan, was the most successful Irish actor in Hollywood. Greer Garson, Maureen O'Hara, there's a few names to conjure with. And she's the one that most people think of. And since I've been writing about Maureen O'Sullivan, most of the questions I have to field initially are ones that confuse the two Maureen's. So Maureen O'Sullivan was Jane in the Tarzan movies. She was Jane opposite Johnny Weissmuller's Tarzan throughout the 30s into the 40s, and she was, hugely successful. And she was kind of had a slightly risque part, particularly in the earlier pre-censorship films where she swims nude, or she body double swims nude, but she had a really long and extended career in Hollywood. But she almost never acted Irish roles, and that's why people, I think, don't think of her as being Irish. She grew up in Killiney, not far from where I am at the moment. And so as she came over with Song of My Heart, which was an Irish musical. And so she comes over to Hollywood and she makes this huge career in Hollywood. I mean, also, let's be fair, she also married a film director called John Farrow, and one of her daughters is Mia Farrow, which only kind of helps to make her retrospectively famous. And another of her daughters is Prudence Farrow, who is, of course, Dear Prudence in the for Beatles fans. So they're a dynasty. And I think that she was, because she always played the sweet girl, she was really pinned to a kind of Irishness, which was always celebrated off screen. She was always the sweet Irish Colleen with the sort of sweet smile. It helped that she had 7 children. So she was always seen as having a kind of Catholic purity that was very celebrated and seemed to be refreshing in Hollywood, which was full of, slightly tired folk. So there was her, and then, of course, Maureen O'Hara, Greer Garson as well. And in fact, funnily enough, when I was researching my book on Maureen O'Sullivan, I found this article from the Irish Independent in the 1930s saying, have Irish actresses taken over Hollywood? Which is bizarre because that's the question we're asking now. But in the 1930s, they saw people as like the 2 Maureens, Greer Garson and others, Geraldine Fitzgerald, as being, as having made something of Hollywood. And yet, bizarrely, history kind of forgot them. So we've suddenly said, oh my goodness, look at all these Irish actors in Hollywood who are doing so well.
One of the things I remember about Maureen O'Hara from my childhood, apart from the fact that my father, I think, had a certain affection for her, I think it had a lot to do with...
He and many others, yeah.
He and many other Irish men of the 1950s, I think. But it's the amount of swashbuckling movies she seemed to star in. Was this some kind of transference of the feisty Colleen into pirate ships or something? I mean, she seemed to be in lots of those films.
That was really what she was famous for. I mean, we think of her in The Quiet Man, and she's very much the feisty Colleen in the Quiet Man. And of course, she did have vivid red hair and a very pale Irish complexion, and that worked incredibly well in Technicolor. So she was known as the Queen of Technicolor, but she was really the Queen of Technicolor because she was the pirate queen of Technicolor. And the swashbuckler is a genre that hasn't really survived into the present day, other than maybe Pirates of the Caribbean. But in the late 40s, early 50s, it was one of the most popular genres, a huge escapist pleasure for audiences. And they churned out swashbucklers, but she was in so many of them. She was in a film called The Black Swan, The Spanish Main, Sinbad the Sailor, Baghdad, Tripoli, Flame of Araby. She was Flame of Araby, Against All Flags, and so on. And the really great thing about those was it enabled her to play active roles. So rather than sitting around waiting to be swept off her feet by a handsome lover, she was in there. She was there's some great sword fights. There's a brilliant one, I think it's in Against All Flags, with Errol Flynn, who was rumoured to be Irish, but he wasn't. He was from Tasmania. But she did her own stunts. She fought her own fights. And so she's a really active character in all these films. And she was also in a classic early feminist film called Dance Girl Dance, which is often seen as one of the foundational by Dorothy Asner, who was an early a film director in Hollywood. And in Dance Girl Dance is a really famous sequence. She's supposed to be the entertainment, and she's playing with Ginger Rogers. in it, and she's supposed to be the kind of foil to Ginger Rogers' beauty and accomplishment as a dancer. And she's supposed to kind of horseplay around the stage and fall over and trip over her skirt and so on. And she gets fed up with this. And there's a really famous sequence where she walks out in front of the audience and she says, "What are you doing in the audience, men? You know, is it good enough to pay your money and come and laugh at other women? And you take your wives to this? Would you laugh at your wife like this?" And so she steps forward. It's a really incredible kind of feminist statement about what about the male viewer in the scene, and she's delivering it. And so she was a very, very strong character and personality, and she had an incredible career in Hollywood.
So we're going to move one more time into the contemporary, whatever we call that. But I suppose if you take it in terms of the Irish American, how it's shape-shifting. We've talked about the middle of the 20th century. There's kinds of different forms of assimilation happening that does seem to map onto the cinema. If we say the contemporary is broadly, let's say, 21st century, 1990s to the present, whatever you want to call it, this most recent generation, I don't get the sense that you have that same strong presence of the Irish in Hollywood. Now, you do today, the moment that we're having, we'll come to it. But from the 90s forward, I mean, it's not a long list of directors and actors, really, is it?
No, there isn't. I think it's because the Irish kind of fell out of favor as being cool immigrants. The cool ethnic immigrants were Latin American, they were Black, they were people of color. And so the Irish, with their whiteness and their assimilation and their basically their success, weren't embraced. The counterculture weren't interested, and they weren't new immigrants any longer. They didn't have that identity as having arrived in America and having to face the difficulties because they were already there, and so they weren't replenishing themselves in the way that, say, Asian groups were. So they kind of fell out of favor. I think the association between Catholicism and institutionalization of Catholicism was also working against them. And many were very conservative too, and that wasn't cool. So they do fall out of favor with Hollywood fundamentally. I mean, you get Irish characters always popping up, but they don't mean much, and they're not in lead roles. There wasn't much opportunity for Irish actors, and there wasn't a great amount of opportunity or people looking for Irish directors to come in. So that really that goes on. I mean, if you want to take the turn of the century, I think, what happens is Ireland at home here is replenishing itself and reinventing itself. And so you get, 1998, more or less, the end of the Troubles, 2000s, the beginning of a kind of reimagination of what it means to be Irish, and particularly around masculinity. You're not just the bruiser, the fighting Irish. You can be sexy and you can be Irish, which is a really big kind of, you're looking in the mirror, you're finding something very different looking back at you. When you get to this point, you get the kind of boy bands. You've got U2, very cool at the time, and then you've got beginning to start. People are coming through like Colin Farrell in the teens, who represents sort of cool bad boy. In the beginning, Colin Farrell was the kind of guy who'd be interviewed eating, burgers and French fries rather than 5 different kinds of lettuce leaf, and that then was a mark of extreme rebellion against the system. And then he was always lots of affairs and so on, and then he kind of calms down, and that suits the zeitgeist as well. He goes to rehab, he becomes a father, and he represents good parenting and good masculinity. So you've got this shift coming through, and it particularly then just sort of erupts in the present moment, where just so many Irish actors. I mean, you can't even, if I listed them, we'd be sitting here all day. And not only are these Irish actors making it big in Hollywood, and let's just list a few of them: Andrew Scott, Paul Mescal, Cillian Murphy, Barry Keoghan, Michael Fassbender, etc., etc., etc. You've also got, for the first time for a really long time, and slightly later, roles for women as well. So you've got Saoirse Ronan coming through, Ruth Negga coming through, Jessie Buckley, massive as a result of Hamlet, though she really was around for a bit longer than that. And actually, last night I went to see Disclosure Day, and Eve Hewson has a really major role. That's, if you haven't been paying attention, that's Bono's daughter. But she's a really successful actor in her own right. So you've got this flood of Irish actors coming into Hollywood, and the popular press begins to pick up on it, and so suddenly all these newspaper headlines are coming through. Slate, New Yorker, are picking up on the story of what are the Irish doing in Hollywood, and they're starting to get Oscar nominations, and then when Cillian Murphy gets his win for
Oppenheimer.
Thank you. When Cillian Murphy gets his win for Oppenheimer, he stands up and he brandishes his Oscar and he says, "I'm," he talks to me about being a proud Irishman. When Jessie Buckley gets her Oscar very recently, she ends up thanking people in Irish, in the Irish language. So there's a kind of funny thing, which is actually their wins are not for Irish characters. Cillian Murphy's not playing an Irish character in Oppenheimer, and Jessie Buckley's not playing an Irish character. And actually, Eve Hewson doesn't play Irish very often, apart from in Bad Sisters on TV, and so on. So it's not because they're big roles for Irish characters on screen. It's there are big places for Irish actors on screen. And there's a real kind of, to me, actually, mind-blowingly, Barry Keoghan has become this huge sort of pin-up sex symbol. And of course, Michael Fassbender already was, Colin Farrell already was, people like Donald Gleeson. Chris O'Dowd in Bridesmaids, he plays the sympathetic Irish cop in Bridesmaids. So again, it's a very different representation of the Irish cop from before, where you've got Chris O'Dowd playing the Irish cop as a sort of sexy guy. So yeah, and everybody's speaking up, everybody's talking about it. I mean, why? Why is the question that is actually quite difficult to answer. But I do think there's something about being seen as a post-colonial country and as a non-imperial country, perhaps. And so the associations, say, of Britishness, it's very hard for British actors to get away from that Englishness, imperialism kind of inheritance. But the Irish have always been the underdogs. And I think there's also perhaps a thing of the Irish not really enjoying being the stardom thing so much, and kind of playing it down a bit and being quite cool about it and being relatable. So, when you see Saoirse Ronan or Jessie Buckley being interviewed, they're talking about being a woman. They're talking actually a lot about being a woman, what that means, what being a mother means. But there is a sort of sense of authenticity, I think, that has accumulated to this particular generation of Irish actors, if that's it.
I just wanted to jump in real quick to talk about the quiet period for a moment, and it may be the exception that proves the rule. But is that, there is the spate in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s with Jim Sheridan in particular. And when you get In the Name of the Father, and when you get The Crying Game, does this really make much of a mark in the United States, or is it very much a phenomenon on this side of the water in the UK as well as in Ireland?
I think what Sheridan and Jordan achieved was that they actually managed to get Hollywood to pay them to make Irish films.
Okay.
So if you think of Michael Collins, right? Michael Collins is funded by Warner's, right? But Jordan had always wanted to make Michael Collins, but he couldn't have made it with Irish funding because there wasn't the money there to make it. He had to get it funded. And the same with Jim Sheridan in The Name of the Father. He persuades Hollywood to fund the film he always wanted to make. But they are important films, and of course we all know the Crying Game was really one of the breakout films for the Weinstein brothers and for Miramax, and for that idea of intense marketing of a film, and it becomes the Dream, which is a low budget film which crosses over into the mainstream. and plays in multiplexes. So I think, you're right. They're really, really important for bridging that gap between Indigenous Irish cinema and Hollywood cinema, and really cleverly manipulating, I think, Hollywood funders. Now, Jordan makes Interview with the Vampire, right? And so that's a purely Hollywood film. And he did it really, really well. I mean, Interview with the Vampire is a great movie. But Jordan has always been very canny. I mean, his career is probably somewhat at an end at this stage, particularly in film. He's writing more, but he was always in his heyday. He was very clever. One for myself, one for the bank, and so he'd make a small Irish movie, and then he'd make a big Hollywood movie, and then he'd make a small Irish movie, and so he was able to carve out a career for himself that was very successful. I mean, Jim Sheridan has always been, always been a bit hit and miss with him. But I do think that In America is his best film. And In America speaks so clearly to that immigrant sensibility. And it's his own family story. He went to America, and that's where he got his limited training as a filmmaker, but he got his opportunities. And it was co-written with his daughters. And I've shown that film. I showed it years ago when I was teaching in Montreal to a class largely composed of immigrants. And they were really moved by it because they saw their own story in that story in America. So I think that's perhaps the film that bridges things with Jim Sheridan. I mean, later on it kind of goes crazy. He makes Get Rich or Die Trying with 50 Cent and said he always regarded 50 Cent as his long lost son. But the audiences didn't fall for that one.
Speaking of what audiences fall for, and because we've mentioned stereotype before, could we say, but keep it really short, something about rom-coms and Irishness?
Yeah, so perhaps, again, we go back to The Quiet Man. What's The Quiet Man? It's a rom-com. But you then get this sequence of really bizarre and really, I mean, to most people's minds, pretty awful rom-coms. Classic, the most successful one is P.S. I Love You, which is actually bizarrely, so it's written by Celia Ahern, daughter of our former Taoiseach. But so she's a rom-com writer, and she writes it, but it's actually English-Irish, the romance. They make it into a movie, and they make it American-Irish, the romance. And it's about, he dies, her Irish lover, who's actually played by Jared Butler, who's Scottish. He dies. She comes back she ends up in Ireland, where she finds her second best lover, who looks extraordinarily like him. And she also, by coming back to Ireland, she's able to sort of get over her grief, and it becomes this kind of restorative space for her. And that's kind of sequence. You get Leap Year, you get Wild Mountain Thyme. There's actually loads of them, and they're all pretty awful. And they're all probably quite embarrassing for the young actors who then played in them and have now become rather more serious actors. But they are about coming to Ireland and finding this beautiful country, which is full of kind of romantic possibility, and these gorgeous young Irish men, and falling in love with the place, the man, and however that works out.
So, Ruth, we've covered an awful lot here in a short time span. As I think you know, this podcast series is broadly referencing America 250, the role of Ireland and the Irish in the making of America in so many different ways. Looking over the period you've looked over here from, the early 1910s to the present, what would you say is really the significance of that Irish role in cinema?
Well, that's the rather big question, Neil.
That is a very big question. I should have warned you that was coming.
I'm hesitant to kind of give you a one-liner on that one.
Yeah.
I guess, one of the things, and we have discussed this, is how it tracks the history of the Irish immigrant in America. So that the shifting roles from being the navvy and the joke and the Bridget who's blowing up the kitchen, to bring to these really much more sophisticated characters that are coming through in later films, tracks. And again, as we talked about, the kind of disappearance of the Irish as a cool ethnicity, and then their reappearance as a cool ethnicity, does track how the Irish themselves have both been have kind of integrated themselves or not integrated themselves into American culture in this period. So I think there is, you've got to be careful about films. They're not a mirror to society. They're only a kind of very cracked mirror. but they do reflect trends, and they both consciously and unconsciously do that. So I think that's really helpful as a way of kind of tracking that history of the Irish in America. And then I think also the resistance to those films by a lot of Indigenous Irish also tracks the diverging pathways of the Irish in Ireland and the Irish in America, and that sense that the Irish in Ireland have of, seriously having laughed at, they have laughed at Irish Americans for a long time. And, the figure of the Yank in Jim Sheridan's The Field is a kind of classic, there he is, this laughably sentimental American who's coming back to buy the field, but also represents a kind of threatening modernization. So diverges and divide. In the sense it comes together, it almost reunites, I think, in the present day, where there is that huge celebration here and in America of Irish actors, and that real sense here of pride in the success of Irish actors in America, even though they're not playing Irish roles. And perhaps that's the thing, in the sense that those Irish roles aren't there for them in the stories, because the Irish have faded into quite a large extent from the stories. And again, perhaps, one film just to kind of, you talked about Banshees of Inisherin, perhaps the other one to talk really briefly about, just to mention, is Brooklyn, which gives Saoirse Ronan one of her few lead Irish roles, and is very much a reflection on the role of the Irish in America, but from the perspective of now. And it's very, very clear that this is not a pastiche. This is a film that's looking back and saying that was then, but this is now. So I think it does encapsulate that kind of quite complicated relationship between Ireland as a country of origin and Irish America as a really strong, vibrant community, but with a particular identity that doesn't fully sort of match up.
Ruth Barton, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for helping us better understand the image of the Irish in the cracked mirror of American cinema.
It's a pleasure, Liam and Scott.
Thank you. That's all for this episode of Ireland and the Making of America.
Thanks to Ruth Barton for joining and sharing her insights on the Irish experience in Hollywood and representations of Irishness in American cinema.
You can follow the series on all your favorite podcast platforms: Apple, Spotify, YouTube. You can follow the Clinton Institute on Instagram and on Facebook, as well as YouTube. You can follow Liam Kennedy there, and you can follow Scott Lucas Worldview for latest audio and video.
And if you enjoyed this episode, subscribe, share, leave a review.
We'll be back next week with another conversation on Ireland and the Making of America.
Until next time, this podcast was brought to you by the Clinton Institute, University College Dublin, and produced with thanks by Michelle May.